The British public has now had more than 2 years to reflect on how successfully the UK's separation from the European Union and the post-Brexit relationship are actually functioning. GL Partners polled a representative sample of 2,078 persons between the 21st and 22nd of September 2022 for the Tony Blair Institute to assess public perceptions of the effects of Brexit and the new relationship with the EU. In today's video, we'll talk about no one likes Brexit anymore, so stay until the end of the video to learn it all. The British people want a reasonable Brexit strategy that acknowledges that, for the foreseeable future at least, the choice to leave Europe cannot be undone, but that Britain needs to maintain a positive relationship with the continent of which they are a part. Britain faces the same difficulties as all other contemporary wealthy nations. A technological transformation comparable to the First Industrial Revolution is taking place today. We must go toward a green economy. The government and public institutions, the NHS, and our educational system need to undergo significant transformation. There is an imbalance between the aging population and the younger, smaller generation. Additionally, short-term politics, often of the populist variety, dominate long-term policies. The most obvious example is the current government's agenda, which rightly emphasizes growth and productivity, but incorrectly assumes that the solutions are those from the 1980s, or scrapping European-wide workplace protections, a policy that is both misguided and unpopular, as our polling shows, when it is obvious that these more fundamental challenges need to be addressed in policy, and addressing in policy, according to a well-thought-out plan, pursued consistently over a period of such a scheme, will most likely now fall under the purview of a future Labour administration. For this long-term goal to have a chance of success, the urgent task is to restore macroeconomic confidence. Most Britons believe that Brexit is still not done. Nearly half of voters believe Brexit is mainly not done, 21%, or not done at all, 45%, compared to over 2/5 who say it is entirely done, 6%, or partly done, 36%. Brexit is not done in the eyes of 2/3 of Remain voters, and done in the eyes of only 1/3. Among those who voted for the UK to leave the EU in June 2016, only 6% of Leave voters believe Brexit is fully complete, with 37% saying it is mostly not done or not done at all. There is a considerable opinion gap between supporters of the two major political parties regarding whether Brexit is still done. Compared to less than a third of Labour, 27%, and Liberal Democrat, 29%, voters, nearly 2/3, 62%, of Conservative voters saw Brexit as done. Most Britons, 59%, believe that Britain's leaving the EU has hurt our economy, while 20% believe it has had no impact, and only 14% think it has improved. Only 6% of the population does not know, which indicates that voters have substantially formed opinions on the economic effects of Brexit, most of which are unfavorable. Most voters believe that Brexit will largely negatively affect their lives, especially on trade, net 52%, and the ease of doing business with the EU, 45%. Northern Ireland, Scotland, and the northeast of England are the regions of the UK where the effects of Brexit are felt the worst. More than a third of voters believe Brexit will not bring any benefits. Most of those who do anticipate gains from the government's independent trade strategy. Few voters anticipate gains right away, and most Leavers believe benefits will manifest within the following 3 to 5 years. The majority of people believe that all key sectors of the UK's relationship with the EU have suffered since Brexit, particularly commerce, net 42%, and collaboration to uphold peace in Northern Ireland, 29%. A solid working relationship between the UK government and the EU is supported by nearly 2/3 of voters, 58%, in favor of the UK government. Votes that were formerly found in the ongoing hostility with the EU are no longer there. At the very least, only a third of the population believes that the UK should try to join the EU single market, whereas more than 2/3 of voters, 70%, believe that the UK should have a closer relationship with the EU than what we currently have. The vast majority of the populace, including Leave voters, is in favor of improved ties with the EU. Widespread popular support exists for increased collaboration in the areas of foreign policy, plus 66%, trade and border agreements, plus 77%, Northern Ireland, plus 68%, and the fight against crime and terrorism, net plus 81%. British voters are pragmatic about what could be necessary to establish a stronger relationship with the EU when evaluating trade-offs. They are willing to compromise if their choices can be made to their advantage. The public is overwhelmingly in favor, 65%, of voluntarily adopting EU regulations, where doing so would result in lower consumer prices. The public is also overwhelmingly in favor, 60%, of accepting a limited future role for the European Court of Justice if doing so increases the ability of UK police to protect Britain. 54% of British citizens, including the majority of Leave voters, favor tighter domestic regulatory safeguards after Brexit, even if this limits their capacity to strike trade agreements with large economies like the United States. If there is any enthusiasm for a regulatory race to the bottom among British citizens, it is limited to 1/5 of all votes. The British population is not very interested in a preferred immigration strategy for European workers. All voters, including little under 50% of Remain voters, 47%, want to treat European employees like other international workers. 2016 Leave and Remain voters are still sharply divided. 2019 Conservative supporters largely share the opinions of Leavers, whilst 2019 Labour and Liberal Democrat voters largely share the opinions of Remainers. This rising support for a different form of relationship with the EU appears to be primarily driven by a shift in mindset among some 2016 Leavers who now seem less certain about the consequences of Brexit. Nearly 1 in 5 Leave voters, 18%, would like to see the UK rejoin the EU or the single market within the next 10 to 15 years, and a further 45% would like to see a closer partnership or a new type of cooperation between the UK and the EU. There is no political benefit to avoiding the discussion of the costs of Brexit thus far. A significant majority of the populace, including Leave voters, believe that Brexit has negatively impacted their lives. Even though major trade agreements are not being made, the British public overwhelmingly supports high standards for the environment, labor and social rights and food safety, which suggests that any deregulation agenda that weakens current protections will have extremely low levels of public support. The results demonstrate that voters typically examine the trade-offs inherent in different choices in a pragmatic way, despite the fact that the general population does simply want to move on from the Brexit debate. Political leaders should be open and truthful with the public regarding the effects of their decisions going forward. Instead of reconsidering the decision to leave the EU or seeking to re-enter the single market or customs union, this discussion must be focused on finding workable answers to real-world issues. Otherwise, there is a definite risk that most voters would perceive this as rehashing previous arguments and stop paying attention to the discussion. Voters want to see gains in important areas of economic security and strategic cooperation with the EU, but the majority are in favor of forging a more intimate but distinct alliance that serves the UK's needs. The results indicate that there is limited political room for the 2019 Conservatives to significantly alter the kind of Brexit policy they have adopted up to this point, because their supporters' views seem to closely resemble those of the Leave voters of 2016. However, a sizable portion of progressive voters, and around a third of Leave voters, would support enhancing the current relationship with the EU, allowing Labour to advocate for an alternative strategy for re-establishing relations with the EU. Brexit is undeniably done, at least in the sense that the UK is no longer a member of the EU and its political and economic institutions. The argument about the nature of the UK's post-Brexit relationship with the EU is still ongoing, despite the fact that the majority of the population can already see the effects of Brexit. The British public is pragmatic in the decisions they would make regarding important aspects of the future relationship, such as maintaining the high regulatory standards that the UK once inherited from the EU, accepting a limited role for the European Court of Justice in the future if doing so means keeping the country more secure or choosing to voluntarily align to EU rules in those areas where doing so clearly results in economic benefits for consumers. With that, we've come to an end. See you next time. Goodbye.